I know what you're thinking. Abandoned asylum, two teenagers sneaking around at night, something waiting for them in the dark. I know how that sounds. I know the reputation those kinds of stories have. And I get it, I really do, because I used to roll my eyes at them too. But this one is real. Every single detail of what I'm about to tell you happened exactly the way I'm going to describe it. No exaggeration, no embellishment, nothing added for effect. Because honestly, what actually happened that night didn't need any of that. I spent most of my summers growing up at my grandparents' place in Traverse City, a small town tucked away in northern Michigan. Beautiful place, the kind of town that feels frozen in time in the best possible way. Surrounded by water, lined with cherry orchards, Traverse City produces about 75% of the world's cherries, which sounds made up, but it's completely true. It's a quiet, peaceful, genuinely lovely place to spend a summer as a kid. But if you grew up there or spent enough time there, you knew about the other thing Traverse City was known for, the Regional Psychiatric Hospital. It opened in 1885 and operated for over 100 years before finally closing its doors in 1989. Even after it shut down, the US government decided the buildings were historically significant enough to preserve, so security guards were hired to patrol the grounds and keep people out. Most of the buildings just sat there after that, empty and slowly falling apart. Over 70 structures spread across the grounds, crumbling quietly while the rest of the town moved on around them. And every single summer, teenagers like me found ways inside. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to pretend it wasn't exciting either. Breaking into the old hospital had become almost a rite of passage for kids in Traverse City. We knew which windows the guards had missed, which padlocks were old enough to pick, and we had learned the patrol patterns well enough that moving around undetected was second nature to us. My friend Marcus and I had been going in for years by this point. We knew every hallway, every stairwell, every dark corner of that place. We even knew the tunnel system underneath the buildings, the long brick passages the hospital staff had used to move patients safely between buildings during the brutal Michigan winters. We weren't scared of it anymore. That was the problem. The night it all went wrong started like every other night we had done it before. It was around 10 p.m., the kind of late summer night where the air is warm, but there's just enough of a breeze to remind you that Michigan winters are never far away. The moon was barely visible behind a thin layer of clouds, which was actually perfect for us, because less light meant less chance of the guards spotting us moving across the grounds. Marcus and I, dressed in dark clothes like we always did, waited for the right moment and slipped in through the same window we had used a dozen times before. The plan was simple. We had a favorite spot inside, one of the tall spires at the top of the main building, where we would sit by the windows and look out over the entire city. On a clear night, you could see for miles, and there was something about being up there in this massive abandoned building in complete silence that felt almost peaceful, which sounds strange given the history of the place, but that's genuinely how it felt after all the times we had been inside. It had stopped feeling scary and started feeling like ours, like a secret place that only we knew about. We followed our usual route through the ground floor, moving carefully and quietly, our phones dimmed as low as they could go because flashlights were too risky with the guards still doing their final rounds. The interior of the hospital was the kind of dark that takes a moment to adjust to, thick and heavy and total, the kind of dark where you feel it pressing against you rather than just seeing it. The floors were warped and crumbling in places, the walls covered in peeling paint and old graffiti left by other kids who had found their way inside over the years. Old broken furniture sat in the hallways exactly where it had been left when the hospital closed. Wheelchairs and gurneys and metal carts, rusted and still, like everyone who worked there had simply walked out one afternoon and never came back. We had seen all of it so many times it barely registered anymore. We moved through it like it was nothing. But then, Marcus stopped walking. I almost walked into the back of him. I whispered his name, and he held up his hand to tell me to be quiet. I stopped and stood completely still, and that's when I noticed it too. A smell. Faint at first, barely there. The kind of thing you almost convince yourself you're imagining. But it was real. Something smoky, but not like fire, not like burning wood or paper. Something thicker and sweeter and older, like incense. Like something was burning somewhere inside the building that had no business burning at all. We looked at each other in the dark, and I could tell from the way Marcus was standing that he was thinking the same thing I was. Someone else was in here tonight.
The smart thing to do would have been to turn around right then and leave. I know that now. Looking back, it seems so obvious, so simple. Just turn around, go back to the window, climb out, and go home, and never think about it again. But when you're a teenager, standing in a dark, abandoned building at 10 o'clock at night, with your curiosity pulling at you harder than your common sense, smart doesn't always win. We decided to follow the smell. It got stronger as we moved deeper into the building, pulling us away from our usual route and down a hallway we didn't normally take. The air felt different in that part of the building, heavier somehow, like the smell wasn't just floating through it, but it settled into the walls, in the floor, and everything around us. Marcus stayed close behind me, and neither of us said a word. We just followed it, step by careful step, until we saw something that stopped us both completely. A glow, deep red, coming from underneath a door at the end of the hallway. Not bright, not flickering like a fire, just this steady, low red light bleeding out from the gap at the bottom of the door and spilling across the floor toward us, like something alive. I had been inside that building more times than I could count, and I had never seen anything like it. I had never seen any light at all that we hadn't brought in ourselves. I put my hand on the door and pushed it open slowly. What we saw inside is something I have genuinely struggled to describe to people over the years, because no matter how I explain it, it never quite captures what it felt like to actually be standing there looking at it. The room was large, mostly empty, the floor thick with dust except for the center, where someone had cleared a wide circle. Inside that circle was a ring of red votive candles, maybe 30 or 40 of them, all lit, casting that deep red glow across every surface in the room. In the very center of it all, was surrounded by a scattered ring of black feathers, was a dead bird. Small, dark-feathered, lying completely still in a pool of dried blood that had spread across the floor, around it like a stain. I remember staring at it and feeling something shift inside me, something that went beyond fear into a place I didn't have a word for at the time. I was raised Catholic, devoutly Catholic, and seeing something like that felt like more than just a scary thing in an abandoned building. It felt like a violation of something I couldn't quite name. Marcus grabbed my wrist so hard his nails left marks on my skin. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just stood in the doorway, staring at what was in front of us, and I'm honestly not sure how long we were standing there before we heard it. A voice, low and calm, coming from directly behind us. "Welcome, friends." There was nothing friendly about the way he said it. I want to be very clear about that because the word welcome implies warmth and comfort, and what came out of that man's mouth was neither of those things. It was flat and deliberate, and it landed on me like a hand on my shoulder in a dark room. Marcus and I both screamed at the same time, the kind of scream that comes out of you before your brain has even finished processing what your ears just heard, and we spun around. Two men were standing behind us in the hallway. They were adults, both of them, older than us by a significant amount, maybe late 30s or 40s. And here's the thing that unsettled me almost as much as anything else about that night. They were nicely dressed, not in robes, not in anything theatrical or dramatic, just regular clothes, neat and put together, the kind of thing you'd wear to a dinner or a work function. But their faces told a different story. They looked frazzled, wired, eyes a little too wide, smiling in a way that didn't reach anything behind their eyes, the kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all, but just a mouth doing what a mouth does when someone wants you to stay calm. The man closest to me was holding something in his hand. I couldn't see it clearly in the dim red light coming from the room behind us, but my brain immediately decided it was a knife. Whether it actually was or not, I genuinely cannot tell you for certain. But given what we had just seen in that room, given the dead bird and the blood and the candles and the pentagram, it didn't feel like a crazy conclusion to reach. Marcus moved first. He grabbed my arm and we both ran at the same time, pushing past the two men into the hallway. I felt fingers close around the back of my shirt as I passed, a solid grip, and for one horrible second I thought that was it, that whoever had grabbed me wasn't going to let go, but I ducked forward instinctively, and the fabric pulled through their hand, and I was free and running. The men shouted at us to stop. We didn't stop. We ran through those dark hallways faster than I had ever run through them before, moving purely on muscle memory and adrenaline, through the corridors and down the stairwell and through the tunnel that led to our escape window. I could hear footsteps behind us for a while, heavy and fast, but the men didn't know that building the way Marcus and I knew it, and somewhere in the dark behind us, the footsteps faded and then disappeared altogether. We hit our window and vaulted through it without slowing down, and kept running across the hospital grounds without looking back once, not caring anymore about the patrol guards, not caring about anything except getting to Marcus's car, which was parked 2 blocks away. When we finally reached it and got inside and locked the doors, I sat there for a moment just trying to breathe, and then I opened the door and threw up twice in the parking lot. I don't know if it was the fear or the sprinting, or both. Probably both. We sat in that car for a long time without saying anything. Marcus had his hands on the steering wheel, even though the engine wasn't running, just gripping it like he needed something solid to hold on to. I was leaning back in the passenger seat, staring at the roof of the car, trying to slow my heart down to something resembling normal. Neither of us looked back toward the hospital grounds. I don't think either of us wanted to. Eventually, Marcus spoke first. He asked me if I was okay. I told him I didn't know. He nodded like that was a completely reasonable answer, because it was. We talked through what we had seen on the drive home, going over every detail quietly, trying to make sense of it the way you do when something happens that your brain doesn't have a category for. The candles, the pentagram, the dead bird, the incense, the 2 men in their neat clothes, standing behind us in the dark like they had been waiting. We went back and forth on what it could have been, whether it was some kind of ritual, whether those men were part of a group, whether they had been coming to that building regularly, or whether that night was something specific and planned. We never came up with answers that felt satisfying. We still haven't. What I do know is this: those men were not startled to see us. They didn't flinch or panic or ask what we were doing there the way any normal person stumbled upon in an abandoned building would. They smiled. They said, "Welcome." They were calm in a way that suggested our presence wasn't entirely expected, or at the very least, wasn't wanted, and that thought has stayed with me longer than any other detail from that night. I'm not familiar enough with occult practices to tell you what they were doing or what they were trying to do. I've read a little about it over the years out of morbid curiosity, but nothing I've found has given me a clean explanation for what we walked into that night. If anyone reading this knows more about it than I do, honestly, I'd rather not know. Some things sit better as questions than as answers. Marcus and I never went back to the hospital. Not that summer, not any summer after that. We drifted apart over the years the way people do, and we don't really talk anymore. But I know that whatever happens in both of our lives, that night will always be the thing that connects us, the thing neither of us will ever fully forget, no matter how much time passes. I still think about those 2 men sometimes, the way they were dressed, the way they smiled, the thing in the first man's hand that I told myself was a knife and have never been able to convince myself wasn't. And most of all, I think about what would have happened if they had caught us. I don't let myself think about that one for too long. I've traveled a fair amount in my life, but I want to be honest with you. Nothing I have ever done or seen or experienced while traveling has come close to what happened to me during that trip to Detroit. I'm Canadian, born and raised in Toronto, and like most Canadians, I had crossed the border into the States plenty of times growing up. Road trips with my family, day trips to Niagara Falls on the American side, the usual stuff. But this trip was different because this time I was going alone, and I was going to see someone I hadn't seen in almost 2 years. Danny and I had been close since we were kids. We grew up on the same street, went to the same schools, spent basically every weekend at each other's houses until his family moved to Detroit when we were both 17.
We kept in touch the way you do when someone moves away, texts here and there, the occasional call, liking each other's posts online. But it wasn't the same as having him around, and we both knew it. So when he called me one evening and told me to come visit, that he had a spare room and nothing planned for the weekend, and that Detroit was actually a great city that got a bad reputation, I booked the bus ticket before we even hung up the phone. I arrived on a Friday morning. Danny picked me up, and we spent the first part of the day just catching up, the easy, comfortable kind of catching up that only happens with people you've known long enough that the gap in time doesn't really matter. We went to this little breakfast place he loved near his apartment, eggs and coffee, and the kind of conversation that jumps from topic to topic without any real direction because there's too much to cover and neither of you knows where to start. After breakfast, we walked around, hit a couple of malls, grabbed food again in the afternoon at this burger place he swore was the best in the city, and honestly, the whole day felt easy and good and exactly like what I needed. Just two old friends in a new city with nowhere to be and nothing to worry about. That all changed when the sun went down. We were sitting on Danny's couch that evening, full from dinner, half watching something on TV when he got that look on his face. I recognized it immediately, even after 2 years apart, because it was the same look he used to get when we were teenagers, and he had an idea that was either going to be really fun or really stupid, usually both. He leaned forward and said he wanted to show me something. I asked him what. He said there was this place outside the city, an old abandoned hospital that had been sitting empty for decades. He said he had been there once before with some friends, and that it was unlike anything he had ever seen, massive and completely isolated, far enough from the main roads that nobody really bothered with it. He said it was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, like everyone who worked there had just walked out one day and never come back. I asked him if it was safe. He shrugged and said it was fine as long as you were careful where you stepped and didn't make too much noise. I asked him if it was legal. He gave me the kind of smile that meant he wasn't going to answer that question directly. I should have said no. I should have told him I was tired from the bus ride and suggested we just watch a movie and call it a night. But the truth is, I was curious. And Danny had always had a way of making bad ideas sound like adventures, and 2 hours later we were in his car driving away from the city lights towards something I wasn't entirely sure I was ready for. The hospital came into view slowly as we drove down a long, narrow road surrounded by trees on both sides. Even from a distance it was imposing, big and dark and completely still against the night sky. Several stories tall, with long wings stretching out from the main building in both directions. No lights anywhere, no cars, no signs of life at all. Just this massive structure sitting out there in the middle of nowhere, like it had always been there and always would be. Danny parked on the grass at the edge of the tree line and cut the engine. We sat there for a moment in the sudden silence, and I remember thinking that the building looked different up close than it had from the road. Heavier somehow, like it had weight beyond just its size. Danny grabbed his flashlight from the back seat, handed me a spare, and said, "Are you ready?" I told him yes. I wasn't. Getting inside was easier than I expected. Danny knew the place well enough to lead us straight to a ground floor window on the far side of the building where the frame had rotted enough that the whole thing could be pushed inward without too much effort. He climbed through first, and I followed, dropping down onto a floor that crunched softly under my feet from years of dust and debris. We turned our flashlights on, and I got my first real look at the inside. It was enormous. The ceiling in the main corridor stretched up so high that the beam of my flashlight couldn't reach the top of it. The walls were covered in peeling paint that had curled away in long strips, hanging down like dead skin. Old metal gurneys sat pushed against the walls in clusters, rusted and still, some of them tipped over on their sides. Doors lined both walls of the corridor, most of them hanging open at odd angles, leading into rooms I could only partially see from where I was standing. Broken glass covered sections of the floor where windows had given way over the years. Water stains ran down the walls in long, dark streaks from ceiling to floor. And it was completely, totally silent.
Not the comfortable silence of a quiet room at night, something heavier than that. The kind of silence that feels like it has been sitting in a place for so long it has become part of the walls. The kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound too loud. Danny moved through it like he belonged there, leading me down the main corridor and then through a set of double doors into what looked like it had once been a large common room. Old chairs were scattered around the space, some overturned, some still sitting in rough circles, like whoever had arranged them had expected people to come back and use them. A television set from what looked like the 80s sat against one wall, the screen smashed inward. Children's drawings were still pinned to a corkboard on the far wall, faded and curling at the edges, but still visible. Stick figures and houses and suns drawn in crayon by hands that had been small a very long time ago. I stood there looking at those drawings for longer than I probably should have. We moved through room after that, taking our time, shining our lights into corners and through doorways, going up stairwells and down hallways and through parts of the building that Danny hadn't explored on his previous visit. An hour passed without either of us really noticing. Then an hour and a half, we had settled into that comfortable explorer's rhythm, where the strangeness of a place stops feeling threatening and starts feeling almost magical, like you're walking through a world that exists outside of normal time. 1 hour and 44 minutes after we climbed through that window, we were standing in a long corridor on the 3rd floor when Danny stopped walking. I almost walked into him. He turned his flashlight off. I whispered his name, and he held up his hand, and I went quiet and stood completely still in the sudden dark. And then I heard it. It was coming from somewhere below us, a sound unlike anything I had heard inside that building for the past hour and 44 minutes of complete silence. Low and broken and raw, like something in serious pain, like something wounded and desperate and completely lost. It rose and fell in a way that didn't sound mechanical, didn't sound like pipes or old buildings settling or anything you could file away under normal explanation. It sounded alive. It sounded like something that was suffering. Danny and I stood completely still in that dark corridor, and neither of us moved for what felt like a very long time. I had my flashlight gripped in my hand, but I didn't turn it on, and neither did he. We just stood there in the pitch black, listening to that sound rising up through the floors beneath us, echoing off the walls and the ceiling and filling the whole corridor with something that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. Then it stopped. The silence that came after it was worse than the sound itself, because silence after something like that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like whatever was making that noise has become aware that it isn't alone anymore. It feels like something listening back. I leaned close to Danny and whispered that we should leave. He didn't argue. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how scared he was, because Danny never backed down from anything without putting up at least a small fight. He just nodded in the dark and turned his flashlight back on and pointed it back the way we came. We started moving. We had taken enough turns and gone through enough doorways over the past hour and a half that getting back wasn't as simple as just retracing our steps, but Danny had a good enough sense of direction that I trusted him to lead us out. We moved quickly but carefully, trying to keep our footsteps quiet, trying not to think too hard about the sound we had just heard, or where exactly it had come from, or whether whatever had made it was still down there. We were halfway down a stairwell when I saw the first shadow. It was on the wall at the bottom of the stairs, cast by nothing I could identify, moving slowly from left to right across the wall before disappearing around the corner. I stopped walking immediately and grabbed Danny's arm. He had seen it too. We stood on the stairwell without moving, both of our flashlights pointed at the bottom of the stairs, waiting. Nothing came around the corner. Nothing made a sound. We looked at each other and kept moving. We reached the bottom of the stairwell and turned the corner where the shadow had been. Nothing there. Just an empty hallway stretching out in front of us, doors on both sides, our flashlight beams cutting through the dark and finding nothing unusual. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and we kept moving, faster now, both of us done with being careful and quiet and just wanting to be outside. We were about 2/3 of the way down the hallway when Danny grabbed my arm and pulled me to a stop. He pointed his flashlight to the left, down a connecting corridor we were just about to pass. I followed the beam with my eyes. At the far end of that corridor, maybe 40 or 50 feet away, was a shadow, just standing there, not moving, not making any sound, just a dark shape at the edge of where our flashlight reached, right at the point where the light gave out and the dark took over. I stared at it, trying to make out any detail, trying to figure out what I was actually looking at, and I couldn't. It was just a shape, the rough outline of something upright and still. And then our flashlight flickered. Just for a second, just a brief stuttering of the beam, but in that fraction of a second of darkness, I felt something shift in the air around us in a way I cannot explain properly, and when the light came back, the shape at the end of the corridor was gone. Danny said one word. He said, "Run." We ran. We flew down that hallway as fast as we could move, flashlights swinging, feet pounding against the rotting floor, not looking behind us, not slowing down, just running toward the double doors at the end that we knew led back to the main corridor, and from there to our window, and from there to outside, and the car, and the road, and every normal thing that existed beyond those walls. We hit the double doors and burst through them, and that's when it happened. Danny's foot went through the floor. Not completely, not up to his knee or anything like that, just his foot and part of his ankle breaking through a section of rotted floorboard that looked solid but wasn't. He went down hard, catching himself on his hands, and I heard him make a sound that was half pain and half shock. I spun around and crouched down next to him, and he was already trying to pull his leg free. The wood had splintered around his ankle, and one of the broken pieces had caught his leg just above the ankle, cutting through his jeans and into the skin beneath. Not deep, but enough to bleed, enough to matter. I grabbed his arm and pulled while he twisted his foot, and after a few horrible seconds, his leg came free, and we were both up and moving again before he had even fully registered how much it hurt.
There was an old house about a mile from where I grew up that most people in town either didn't know about or chose not to think about. It sat back from the road so far that you couldn't really see it from passing cars, hidden behind decades of untended growth, trees and bushes and tall grass that had swallowed the property so completely that the house had essentially disappeared into the landscape. If you didn't know it was there, you never would have found it. I only knew about it because an older kid from my neighborhood had mentioned it once in passing, the kind of offhand comment that plants itself in your brain and refuses to leave. He said there was an old house back in the trees that looked like nobody had touched it in 50 years. He said he'd gotten close enough to see it through the growth, but never gone inside. That was enough for me. I convinced Sarah to come with me on a Saturday afternoon in late summer when we had nothing better to do, and the kind of restless energy that makes bad ideas feel like adventures. We parked on the road and pushed our way through the tree line on foot, following what might have been a driveway at some point, but was now just a suggestion of a path buried under years of overgrowth. The grass came up to our waists in places, and the branches overhead had grown together into a thick canopy that blocked most of the afternoon light, making it feel later and darker than it actually was. And then, the house came into view. It was beautiful in the way that only abandoned things can be. A large two-story brick home with tall windows and a wide front face that had clearly been impressive once, the kind of house that belonged to someone who had money and wanted people to know it. But nature had been working on it for a long time. Vines crawled up the brickwork on both sides, the gutters had pulled away from the roofline in places, and every window we could see from the front was filmed over with years of grime. But the structure itself looked solid. The walls were straight, the roof appeared intact, and the front of the house had a quiet dignity to it that made you feel almost sorry for it, sitting out here forgotten while the world moved on without it. Sarah grabbed my arm and said it was beautiful. I agreed with her. I should have listened to the part of me that also thought it was deeply, deeply unsettling. Getting inside wasn't as straightforward as we expected. The front door had no steps leading up to it, just a gap where a porch or stoop must have been at some point, too high to climb up to without something to stand on. We circled around to the side of the house, pushing through more overgrowth,
and found a side door that had already been kicked in at some point, hanging open at an angle on one hinge. Someone had been here before us at some point, though from the look of the cobwebs stretched across the door frame, it hadn't been recently. We ducked under the cobwebs and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, that particular smell that old houses have, layered and complex, wood and dust and something underneath that you can't quite name, like the accumulated weight of decades of life pressed into the walls and the floors and the air itself. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just heavy, like breathing in time. And then my eyes adjusted, and I got my first proper look at the interior, and I stopped walking completely. It was like stepping into a photograph. Everything was still there, all of it. The furniture, the decorations, the personal belongings, everything you would expect a family to take with them when they left was still sitting exactly where it had been left, arranged and positioned like someone had just stepped out for an hour and planned to come back. A large sofa sat against the wall of the main room, with cushions that had faded from whatever color they'd once been to a uniform dusty gray. A coffee table in front of it still had a glass on it, long since dried out, a dark ring left on the wood where the liquid had evaporated decades ago. Framed photographs lined the walls, faces staring out from behind grimy glass, men and women dressed in the styles of the 1950s and 60s, formal and stiff, the way people looked in photographs back then, like they weren't entirely sure what smiling was for. Sarah whispered that it was like they'd just walked away from everything. I told her that was exactly what it looked like. We moved deeper into the house, room by room, taking our time, both of us speaking quietly without really deciding to, the way the atmosphere of a place can impose its own rules on you without saying anything. Every room was the same, untouched, preserved, frozen. A dining room with chairs still pushed in neatly around the table, a study with books still on the shelves, and a pen sitting on the desk like someone had just set it down. A bedroom with the bed made and the drawers closed, and a pair of shoes sitting neatly at the foot of the bed like their owner had just stepped out of them. Nobody had taken anything. Nobody had come back for any of it. That thought sat in my stomach in a way I couldn't quite shake. We found the kitchen upstairs, which sounds like a strange thing to say, but that's exactly where it was, on the second floor at the end of a short hallway, which was odd enough that both Sarah and I commented on it. Houses from that era sometimes had unusual layouts, I knew that, but a kitchen on the second floor still felt wrong in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Like one small detail in an otherwise convincing picture that your brain keeps snagging on no matter how hard you try to look past it. The kitchen itself was large and well appointed for its time. Old appliances that would have been considered top of the line when they were new, a refrigerator with rounded edges and a chrome handle, a stove with more dials than it probably needed, countertops that had once been white but had yellowed to the color of old paper. Everything was coated in the same fine layer of dust that covered everything else in the house, but the layout was neat, organized, the kind of kitchen that belonged to someone who took pride in it. We spent a few minutes in there looking around and then moved back out into the upstairs hallway. That's when I noticed the arch. It was at the far end of the hallway, a wide decorative arch opening into a large room beyond, the kind of architectural detail that was common in older homes, but still felt grand and intentional. I walked toward it, with Sarah just behind me, and we stepped through into what I can only describe as a gentleman's study or a man cave built for someone with serious money. Dark wood paneling on the walls, a large leather chair in one corner, shelves lined with what looked like a mixture of books and collectibles, a bar cart against one wall still fully stocked with bottles that had gone dark and syrupy with age. It was an impressive room, the kind of room that told you a lot about the person who had designed it and spent time in it. But what caught my attention more than any of that was the mirror. It was enormous, floor to ceiling almost, leaning against the wall to the right of the arch in a heavy, ornate frame that had once been gold but had tarnished to a dull brown. It reflected the whole room back at us, the leather chair and the bookshelves and the bar cart, and the two of us standing in the archway looking at it. I don't know why it made me uncomfortable. There was nothing wrong with it, nothing unusual about a large mirror in a room like this, but something about seeing our own reflections in that dark, dusty glass, in that silent house, made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't felt since we walked through the door. I stood there looking at it for a moment, and then I turned to Sarah and told her I wanted to leave.
The words had barely left my mouth when I felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, nothing I could point to or describe in any concrete way, just a feeling, the sudden absolute certainty that there was someone standing directly beside me, not behind me, not across the room, right beside me, close enough that if I turned my head, I would be looking directly at them. I didn't turn my head. I don't know why. Some instinct I wasn't even aware of told me very clearly not to turn and look, and I listened to it in the way you listen to instincts in moments like that, completely and without question. I stood completely still and stared straight ahead, and the feeling didn't go away. It sat right there beside me, solid and present and completely impossible, because I could see the whole room reflected in the mirror in front of me, and there was nothing there. Just me and Sarah and the dark paneled walls and the leather chair and the bottles on the bar cart and the dust floating in the thin light coming through the grimy window. Nothing beside me, but the feeling didn't care what the mirror showed. It just stayed there, patient and heavy, like something that had been in that room for a very long time and wasn't particularly surprised to have company. Sarah said my name. She asked if I was okay. I told her yes, and I took 3 steps away from the mirror toward her because I needed to be closer to another person, and I needed to be further from whatever I was feeling beside me. And that's when I saw it. I almost missed it. The mirror was large and grimy, and the light in the room was dim, and my eyes had been focused on the reflection of the room rather than the surface of the glass itself. But when I took those 3 steps and the angle shifted slightly, I saw it clearly. And once I saw it, I couldn't understand how I had missed it at all. Written on the surface of the mirror in bright pink lipstick, large enough to fill most of the glass, were 2 words: "Get out." Not scratched in, not painted, not carved, written, deliberately and carefully in the kind of bright, cheerful pink that belonged on a makeup table, not on the surface of a floor-to-ceiling mirror in an abandoned house that nobody had been inside in decades. The letters were neat and even, and they filled the mirror from one side to the other, and they were directed at whoever was standing in front of it, at whoever was standing exactly where I had been standing 30 seconds ago. I grabbed Sarah's hand, and we left. We didn't discuss it, we didn't debate it, we didn't take one last look around. I said we need to go right now, and she heard something in my voice that made her not ask questions, and we walked out of that room, and down the hallway, and down the stairs, and out through the broken side door, and back through the overgrowth toward the road without stopping or slowing once. We didn't speak until we reached the car. Sarah got in the passenger seat and I got behind the wheel, and I sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, just trying to organize my thoughts into something that made sense. The afternoon light outside felt almost aggressively normal, bright and warm and completely indifferent to what we had just experienced inside that house. And there was something almost disorienting about that, about stepping from one world into another in the space of a single footstep. Sarah asked me what happened in that room. I told her about the feeling beside me, the certainty of a presence that the mirror showed nothing of, the 3 steps I took toward her, and then the writing on the glass that I somehow hadn't seen until that moment, even though it was enormous and unmissable and had clearly been there the entire time we were standing in that room. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she asked me something that I have thought about many times since that afternoon. She asked me if I thought the writing had been there when we walked in, or if it had appeared while we were standing there. I told her I didn't know. I still don't know. That's the part that has stayed with me the longest, not the feeling beside me, not even the words themselves, but that question.
Because the truth is, I have no way of answering it. We were both looking at the room, at the furniture and the shelves and the bar cart, and neither of us had looked directly at the mirror surface itself until those final few seconds. It could have been there the whole time, written years ago by someone else who had found their way inside, a warning left by a previous visitor, a prank, graffiti from a teenager with a sense of humor dark enough to match the house. Or it wasn't there when we walked in. I drove us home, and we talked about other things on the way you do when something happens that neither of you has the right words for yet. We got food on the way back, sat in a drive-thru and ordered like normal people, and ate in the car and talked about something completely unrelated. And it helped. It genuinely helped to just be two people eating fast food in a car in the middle of a normal afternoon. But I thought about that mirror all evening and the next day, and I still think about it now when something reminds me of it. An old house glimpsed from a road, a large mirror in an antique shop, the particular quality of light in a room that hasn't been lived in for a long time. I never went back to that house. I don't know if it's still standing or if the trees have finally finished swallowing it completely. I never found out who lived there or why they left everything behind or how long it had been sitting empty before we stumbled across it. And I never found out who wrote those two words on that mirror or when.